Greenware? What is that? We're back. We're going to talk a little bit about the terminology of clay. And in this particular case, we're going to talk about the clay itself. Okay? So what you got in your package is a 13-pound block of clay. When you open it up, you'll feel it. It's cool. There's moisture in it. If you grab at it, you can pretty much tear it apart. You can actually, just easily grab a handful of it. Now, clay itself is bound very tightly, just like we talked about. It has little platelets, it has water in between them, okay? And part of that is the reason why it is so flexible, okay? And so if you take a little piece of clay, and just do a little piece like this, okay? If you have a little piece of clay like this, take it in your hand and bend it around, okay? Roll it out. Okay? What you'll start to find is the more you work with it, it will start to get dry. Especially if you take a teeny weeny little piece like this, okay? You can see the moisture coming off onto my hands, okay? And if I keep doing this and I make this tiny little coil, you'll start to see a bunch of little cracks in it. Now those little cracks will form because the clay is drying out. So what this leads me to talk about is the fact that clay has different stages of wetness. Okay? It doesn't stay wet like this forever, and that is very important to know, because the number one thing people do that ruins their project is they let it dry out too quickly. So number one, clay has water in it, okay? And it helps bind the particles together. Having said that, one of clay's worst enemies is captured air. So if you start to take your clay apart like this, okay, and I'm just using a little bit of the clay that I gave you, okay, and you stick it together, it sticks, it does, okay? But what is happening is you could be trapping little bits of air inside of there. And if you're trapping little bits of air inside, then you're going to have a little bit of an issue later on, okay? So be mindful of that, okay? So this is fresh clay. It is malleable, it is wet, and it's bendable. The term used in clay for the ability to bend it is called plasticity. It's like plastic, bendable, here, plasticity, right there. Let's see, make it fit. Good? Okay. And different types of clay will have different amounts of plasticity. I'm going to use a different word because I can't say it very well. Okay? So clay, when you think about it, is dirt. It comes from the ground. It comes from digging really deep into certain areas. Sacramento, we're in basically a valley, a riverbed, and so we're rich in clay. It's not like you go to the rocks in the mountains and you can make clay out of that. No, they're fused together from, all the volcanoes and stuff like that. So when you're talking about clay, you are talking about dirt. So different clays will have different amounts of rocks and fossils and waste in them. So you are going to get different colorization, different amounts of pebbles and grog in there. Some clays, like porcelain, are incredibly smooth and soft, but they dry out real quick. So what we have here is basically a good general purpose clay, has a decent amount of little particles in there to help the plasticity. Right? All right. So moving on, this little piece of clay that I have now worked with for 5 minutes or so, it's starting to dry out, it's starting to crack. And I kind of want you to go through that process just to understand that clay is quite fragile. And a big part of this class is understanding how to work with things that are fragile and making them strong. So go ahead and give it, give it a little bit of workout. Really try to actually make this dried out. You can even try rolling a coil with it, right? And again, the more you work with it, the more you bend it, the more you try to make something out of it, right? Tear it apart. Just after no more than 5 minutes in working with it, it's going to start to become difficult to work with it. Okay? And if I left this out, if I left this chunk of clay out, for a few hours, maybe even a day, depending upon the weather, I am going to get a piece of clay that's sort of like this. Okay? This piece of clay went to the market. Just kidding. It didn't go to the market. It stayed home and it got firm. Okay? Now check out this clay here. It is still wet. It is still cold to the touch. If I try to bend it, it breaks apart. That's not a bad thing. It's just a different stage of clay. That stage of clay, when the moisture starts to evaporate and the surface of the clay starts to become stiff, but it still has a lot of moisture in it, that's considered leather hard. Mostly because it actually has sort of this leathery feel. It still has moisture in it, yet it's not very flexible. It's durable, right? It doesn't just fall apart, but you can't bend it like you can nice clay like this, right? Even this is starting to get a bit old. Okay? The last stage, this is bone, called bone dry. If I kept this chunk of clay that we just took out of the bag no more than, 7, 8 minutes ago, if I took that, let it sit there on the table for a while, it would eventually start to become leather hard, right? And then after a day or two, depending on how thick it is, it would become, and I'm going to use a sculpture from somebody from last year, bone dry. Now this sculpture has been sitting on a shelf for months, okay? So it no longer, and this is maybe a bad example to show what, this one was never going to be fired, and I'll get to that. But this particular one is so dry that if I dropped it, it wouldn't smush. It would break, it would shatter, okay? I'll demonstrate in just a bit. Okay. I'm not going to smash this one because it's actually quite nice. Okay. But this is bone dry. It really can't be bent anymore. I can't add clay to it anymore. It just won't work. We'll get to why that is in a little bit. Okay. But bone dry clay, as far as a sculpture is concerned, once it gets to this stage, it is ready for firing. Firing is a process of extracting all the moisture out of a sculpture so that it becomes really hard and durable. Okay? Kind of like pottery, when you have a terracotta pot, there's no moisture in it. It soaks up water, but it's stiff and it's hard. It's breakable, right? So that bone dry clay, as far as the sculpture is concerned, turns into what is called greenware, and that's what this sculpture is, greenware. And that's the stage that we will, as a class, get to with our projects, because the next step requires that you actually fire the piece in the kiln. We'll still explain what that is. You still should know the process, but for this particular situation, we may not get beyond greenware, dried clay. All right. So, which leads me to why we would need plastic in addition to what's in the bag. Because if a clay piece dries, then we can't work on it anymore, right? So having some extra plastic to keep your clay wrapped up tight. Let's say like this is an awesome sculpture. Yeah, it's so cool, it's rad, it's awesome. And I want to work on it tomorrow, but I have to go and eat dinner and I don't have any more time for the day. Okay? I want to make sure that I wrap this up in plastic. Something small like this, sandwich bags work great. Something larger, you'll probably need maybe a trash bag or even a shopping bag. The more air resistant, the better. Those bags from the dry cleaners work really, really well as well. Okay? So keep your sculpture covered if you want to keep it wet. If you want it to start to dry out, loosely cover it. And then if you want it to completely dry out, so it gets bone dry and it turns into greenware, leave it out in the air for it to dry. Okay? And those are the stages of clay as far as wetness goes.